Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. Despite the continuing promises from President Donald Trump that a Gaza ceasefire deal is imminent, the White House visit last week by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu offered no such hope. Any movement on a Gaza ceasefire deal seems to continue to be, pardon the expression, held hostage to Netanyahu's need to appease his far-right coalition partners and keep his increasingly fragile coalition together. But where is some hope of diplomatic progress and reconciliation possible? President Trump, at least, has been referring frequently to Israel's northern neighbor, Syria, in its post-Assad era, as potentially joining the Abraham Accords as he looks for wins that could get him his coveted Nobel Peace Prize. And meanwhile, the Iran threat has not gone away. Israel and the world is keeping a close eye on what's happening there, attempting to assess exactly how far the 12-day round of military conflict with Israel actually set back Iran's nuclear program, and whether or not that conflict could reignite. Joining me on the podcast to talk about the dynamic situation is an expert in Israel security, Chuck Freilich. Professor Freilich is Israel's former deputy national security advisor. Today, he teaches at Columbia and Tel Aviv universities, and he's a frequent contributor to Haaretz. Our conversation coming up.
I'm Esther Solomon, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions. At the same time, your subscription supports the cause of a free press that holds the powerful to account in Israel and around the world. I invite you to become a subscriber to Haaretz now. Just go to Haaretz.com and use the code Haaretz10, that's Haaretz with the number 10, for 10% off an annual subscription.
Professor Chuck Freilich, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Chuck, let's start with the current headlines about what's happening on the ground in Syria right now. As we record even, there have been Israeli strikes on the Syrian city of Sueda after the regime there says the city's leaders declared a ceasefire and the Syrian army forces began withdrawing. That's part of transferring the control of the city to the internal security forces. Israeli officials briefing the press on these strikes are saying it is, quote, a test for implementing its policy of demilitarizing southern Syria and its commitment to the Druze. Chuck, can you briefly explain for those of us who have not been following this closely what exactly is happening there and why Israel is striking?
Well, we're talking about events that are unfolding as we're talking, so it's hard to get a deep understanding of what actually has happened there. But first of all, the immediate cause of this was conflict between local Druze, and this area is the heart of the Syrian Druze community, and some Bedouins. Something like 99 people were killed in this fighting, and the regime intervened to try and quell the fighting, and as you mentioned, reached a ceasefire. Now, Israel has a long-standing commitment to its own Druze community, and that community has been pressing the government very hard, actually throughout the civil war in Syria, but especially, let's say, in the last year, to intervene on behalf of their brethren. And also, then you have to put this in the context of what's happened since the fall of the winter, since the collapse of the Assad regime and the rise of the new, ostensibly Islamist regime, which at the same time despite the fears of that it's being an Islamist regime and outgrowths of Al-Qaeda and radical, in point of fact, has taken a relatively moderate approach, certainly in its foreign policy and even domestically, and remarkably has begun talks with Israel. It itself acknowledges that these talks are taking place. And it seems that what we're talking about at this point is a non-belligerence agreement, which could in the future lead to a peace agreement. And the very fact that this is going on is absolutely mind-boggling if one considers the history between Israel and Syria.
So for now, you don't think that Israel intervening in this puts all of this at risk?
Maybe. And that's why I'm quite concerned here whether short-term gains, and this is part of the policy, the post-October 7th policy of not allowing potential threats to evolve on any of Israel's borders. But here the intervention by the regime was so limited. They sent in something like a half a dozen tanks yesterday. That's certainly not a threat of any significance to Israel. And I would think that we could have used the channels of communication to reach some sort of understanding here. But the government seems to be taking a really absolutist approach. And yeah, I find it concerning.
So that brings us to your recent analysis in Haaretz, which is headlined, Israel should help shape a new Syria, but it must do so carefully, quietly, and quickly. There are a lot of whys to answer in that headline. Can you start for us, Chuck, with the why is it in Israel's interest to be part of shaping the new Syria?
If we don't participate in it, then events take their own course, and the likelihood of them taking a negative course increases. And there really is an unusual, I think, an unexpected opportunity here with this new regime, because they are saying the right things, at least in terms of Israel. They're talking to us. They seem to be really willing to reach some sort of agreement. They have not condemned the attack, for example, against Iran. Not only that, but this is a regime which has thrown the Iranians and Hezbollah out of Syria. They are strongly anti-Iranian, probably as much as we are. So there's a meeting of interests here that we should be really working to take advantage of.
Now let's look at the carefully and quietly part of the headline and talk about what kind of a deal or agreement or settlement Israel should be looking to make with Syria. You argue in your piece that instead of going right for a full-scale peace agreement or some sort of normalization, Israel should look to, quote, a far more pragmatic approach to ensure quiet on its northern border. So what do you suggest?
Israel's role here is to suggest to the U.S. that it lead the establishment of a multinational mechanism to coordinate Syrian stabilization and reconstruction. And if that happens, and if stabilization and reconstruction actually happen, that, of course, addresses our own interests, because we want to stabilize the northern border. And it looks like we have an interest in keeping this government in power. It's not a done deal. They still face serious domestic challenges, for example, what we were just talking about a minute ago. So this would be a mechanism led by the U.S. with the Syrian government as an active partner, and the two countries would actually have a joint veto or a shared veto over the decisions made by the overall steering committee, which would include the primary Arab states, the Saudis, the UAE, Egypt, Jordan, and others, and the E3, the French, Germans, and British, and other countries that would be willing to sign on to the founding principles, for example, maintaining Syrian independence and sovereignty and preventing the Iranians from re-entrenching themselves there. Israel's role, again, is a quiet one behind the scenes, because if we're openly involved and if we're directly involved, that will at best reduce Arab interest in joining and possibly prevent at least some of them from doing so.
Is that why you don't want to go the whole 9 yards with the peace agreement, normalization, joining the Abraham Accords? Because that's clearly what President Trump wants. He loves his White House lawn ceremonies.
Yeah, well, we'd all like to see that. I'd be thrilled if it could happen, but I think that's a bridge too far. The very fact that this new government is talking to us about even a partial agreement, non-belligerent, which might have some semblance of normalization, is a dramatic change. And so let's not let the very good be the enemy of the perfect. And maybe in a year or two or three, they'll be able to go further.
So things are happening, right? It's been reported that direct Israeli talks with Syrian officials have taken place, as you mentioned earlier. So not so quietly. As we record, even Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar is at the same EU Middle East meeting in Brussels as his Syrian counterpart, Assad Hassan al-Shabani. People are making a big deal of that, whether or not they meet personally in public or behind the scenes. Can you gauge from what you see the amount of progress that is actually happening when it comes to direct contact between Israel and Syria?
Well, we don't know the details of what's being discussed. Everything that I've been saying is based on media reporting, on partial leaks from various parties. The fact is, President Ashara, the new Syrian president, confirmed that the talks are taking place. So it's not just a matter of reporting at this point. If they meet publicly, that would be nice, of course. There was a Syrian official, or at least someone aligned with the regime, who visited Israel recently. Things are moving, and even if it takes a bit more time, there's the potential here for a dramatic change.
What are the U.S. interests here? Do you think that the Trump administration's decision to lift most of the sanctions on Syria was the right move? And do you think that the U.S. will take as active a role in Israel-Syria reconciliation as you suggest, given the MAGA American first attitude about avoiding U.S. involvement in messy Middle East situations? Or do you think that the interventionists are going to convince President Trump that if he doesn't move forward, Russia and China will move in to fill the void?
Well, I don't think this is an issue of intervention, and so it shouldn't be controversial for MAGA supporters or opponents. All I'm suggesting here is a diplomatic effort by the U.S. It's not a major one. It doesn't necessarily require presidential involvement, certainly not significant. It could be the ambassador to Syria, who's actually based in Ankara. It could be some other senior American official, but it's a diplomatic effort to lead the establishment and then the work of this multinational mechanism. And there are no military aspects to this, certainly from an American perspective. I don't see any downsides from the United States point of view. And this may not lead to anything, but it may also help stabilize Syria. And the U.S. has an interest in that. The U.S. has an interest in ensuring that they do not restore relations with Iran and Hezbollah. And I think actually what we see here is a potential win for the U.S. in the global competition with China and Russia, because if they want to join this coalition on U.S. terms, fine. But then they're joining on U.S. terms. If they don't join, then they have zero influence. As it is, the U.S. would be leading an important initiative in the region. The U.S. just joined, more correctly, the Israeli initiative in attacking Iran, showing just how irrelevant China and Russia are to the Middle East today, really. And this is at a time when, at least in recent years, we thought that the two of them were on the rise in the region, and we were particularly concerned about increasing Chinese influence. And it turns out that they can keep buying lots of Middle Eastern oil, but they really have almost no role in diplomacy and in military affairs. And this is an initiative which would further increase that situation, strengthen it.
Where does Turkey fit into all this? I remember they were these big backers of the coup in Syria. The relationship between Turkey and Israel seems to be at a low point, while President Trump seems rather fond of Erdogan. So how does that all fit together?
Yeah, well, Mr. Trump's personal preferences have raised eyebrows in the past more than once. Turkey has strong national interest in what happens in Syria. First of all, it's just a neighbor, but more importantly, it's a neighbor whose civil war sent a few million refugees into Turkish territory, and they're still there. And of course, you have the Syrian Kurds who want autonomy, and they have broad ties with the Turkish Kurds who want autonomy. And for Turkey, there's probably no more important national security issue than the Kurdish one, because they consider it a threat to their national unity, their territorial integrity. So what happens with the Syrian Kurds is of great interest to them. They maintain a military presence along the border with northern Syria. And yes, they have long wanted to see Assad out. They eventually became reconciled to the fact that he was going to be there. And they were happy when this new Sunni Islamist regime took over. In the meantime, it turns out that the regime uh, wants Turkish support and maybe even help in some areas, but they're quite wary of being dominated by the Turks. And they're trying to prevent that from happening. And you're absolutely right that Turkish-Israeli relations, well, maybe after a long series of lows, that they're even at a lower one. But the fear a half a year ago was that we could even reach blows over what's happening in Syria. In the meantime, a coordinating mechanism has been established, and it looks like that fear is probably no longer substantiated. But we've got enough issues hurting the bilateral relationship. We don't need another one.
I'm curious how this affects the situation in Lebanon. And at the same time, I'm wondering how tethered is all of this to the ongoing situation in Gaza? Could this really all move forward and leave Gaza behind once again?
I don't think there's a direct relationship with what's happening in Gaza. I mean, that's a whole separate issue. And both Israel and Hamas are continuing to stick to their basic positions. So I'm hopeful, but actually quite doubtful whether we're going to see a breakthrough there. What's happening both in Syria and Lebanon are really separate issues. I discussed the Syrian one. Lebanon is also undergoing major changes. Hezbollah was decimated back in the fall, and its political influence in Lebanon is much less than it was until then. There's a chance, and it's still a chance, but the possibility that Lebanon can really reemerge as an independent state, not entirely free of Iranian and Hezbollah influence, but much, much less so. And there were talks, at some point, Israel may get out of the additional uh, strongholds that we took in the south because the Lebanese are going ahead with security measures. People have talked again about Lebanon, just like Syria, becoming part of the Abraham Accords. I don't think we're anywhere near there yet. But again, maybe some sort of security agreement could happen. And we are talking with the Lebanese, trying to be supportive of what's happening there. They would like us to do more. It's always the case. There's a potential for good things to happen there after about, I say, 5 decades of nothing but misery on the Lebanese border.
Well, it's always good to hear some positive news after what we've been through in Israel these days. So speaking of the bad news, let's turn to your other area of expertise, Iran. Do we have any information yet as to whether there were, in fact, secret enrichment facilities that survived Israel and the U.S. attacks last month that would still allow Iran to move forward quickly? And can Israeli and U.S. intelligence assets assess its capabilities as far as you see, or are we still in the area of a guessing game in terms of how much was actually destroyed and how far set back they are in terms of their nuclear abilities?
Well, I think Iran is so penetrated by Israeli and American and other Western intelligence services that it's hard to imagine that they have secret enrichment and conversion facilities. The conversion is to take the uranium, the enriched uranium, and turn it into a metallic form, which you need for the core of the bomb. Without those two kinds of facilities, they can't produce a bomb, even if the 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium survived the war. And we don't know if that's the case. There's good reason to believe that it didn't, but we don't know. Their enrichment capabilities were basically destroyed or greatly downgraded. The one conversion facility that they had in Isfahan was definitely destroyed. So there's some reason for optimism here. The American media seem to a certain extent, to refuse to be willing to accept some good news here. The skepticism was so great. But there's some reason for optimism. The Iranians have to take into account now that since they are so penetrated, an attempt to renew the program, in other words, to rebuild the enrichment and conversion facilities, would be picked up rather quickly. And if that's the case, that they would in all likelihood be bombed again by Israel or the US or both.
In the best case optimistic scenario, they don't have these secret facilities. Has the attacks bought Israel and the world years, months? How long before it has to worry about a nuclear Iran again?
Well, I think we have to worry about it today, but the how long was achieved by these attacks is still an open question. The more sober intelligence estimate says that about a 2-year gain was achieved. That again assumes that they don't immediately start rebuilding conversion and enrichment facilities, and that they aren't caught, and that nobody bombs them or sabotage operations like the Mossad has reportedly been conducting in Iran for years. So a 2-year gain could, of course, become significantly longer. Two long-term questions here. One is, what conclusion do the Iranians draw from what just happened? Is it that, oh, we have to race to a bomb because it's the only way that we can ensure that no one will attack us in the future? Or do they come actually to the opposite conclusion that, hey, this is the one thing that just led to our nightmare scenario of an Israeli and American attack on us? And I think there will be a very, very serious debate in Tehran about this. The Iranians are very, very carefully calculating actors here. And the second question that we have to take into account now is there a new nuclear deal? Now, short term, the Iranians, it's been, what, about a month? The Iranians couldn't come back to the table yet. They lost such face, but they're making sounds like they want to come back to the table. A nuclear deal is the only way that we can ensure that they don't cross the threshold for the long term, because military action now gained a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever. If they want to reconstitute, they can because they have the know-how. The only way, let's say, to achieve a 20, 30, or hopefully indefinite freeze on the program is through a nuclear deal.
Do you think that this time around, Israel and the United States would be on the same page as to what that deal should contain? Or do you think there would still be big differences as we've seen in the past?
There was surprisingly close coordination between the U.S. and Israel on the so-called 12-day war. Pretty much everything was worked out in advance. And so there's a reason, let's say, to be optimistic that Netanyahu and Trump can reach an understanding on where we go forward as well. But there is a basic difference here, or potential for it, in that Trump, I think, would like to focus the deal just on the nuclear issue. He'd like to bring in the ballistic missiles and Iran's so-called malign activities around the region. But the U.S. could probably settle just for a nuclear deal. Israel will try and hold out for the other two elements, for the ballistic missiles, because they've become almost as a greater threat as the nukes themselves, and the regional role. We'll see.
You wrote in Haaretz that the least bad option for Tehran may be something called malign neglect. Can you explain what you mean by malign neglect and how the U.S. and Israel would need to respond to that choice?
Well, the idea was that what the Iranians might do is simply sit quietly and bide their time, let the issue disappear from the headlines. The world will go on to other issues, and maybe, hopefully, from their point of view, the U.S. and Israel might at least partly take their eye off the ball. And they wait until the appropriate time comes about, and that's probably not for another year, 2, 3, or more. And then they begin quietly reconstituting the program and hope that they can get away with it and reach the point where maybe they could rapidly break out to the capability. That would be a problem for both the U.S. and Israel, because now there is still strong international support behind the efforts to prevent them from going nuclear. We see, for example, the E3 threatening that if there isn't a deal by the end of August, this was just, I believe, today or yesterday, if there isn't a new deal by the end of August, they will reimpose the so-called snapback sanctions, which are the Security Council sanctions that were imposed on Iran after the 2015 nuclear deal, which have now all been lifted, and which the ability to restore them expires in October, which is why the E3 set this end of August deadline. The current circumstances are more favorable for the U.S. and Israel to get a deal. The Iranians are still in a state of shock over what happened. A few years from now, who knows what will happen?
If the Iranians decide to save face and keep refusing to go to the table, what are the moves that you think could trigger a renewed Israeli strike against Iran. I'm asking because Israelis are now sort of in a limbo. Should we keep our bomb shelters at the ready or not? I say in my house, our bomb shelter is also a storeroom where we keep a lot of stuff. We still have all the things we keep there out in the living room in case we need it again. What do you think? This is a practical question. What do you think could happen that would renew a military conflict, and how likely do you think it is that that would happen?
Well, I think you can move your stuff back into the shelter. I don't think that there will be military action for the foreseeable future unless the Iranians do something really drastic and frankly stupid, and they are anything but stupid actors. Down the line, they can do what I was saying before, which is to quietly begin reconstituting. If we see them trying to gain access to the 400 kilos of highly enriched uranium, which seem to be buried under the sites that the U.S. attacked. If we see them building enrichment or conversion facilities, those are reasons that Israel and maybe the U.S. Would act. But for the moment, I think we can all take a deep breath.
With that deep breath, Professor Chuck Freilich, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and, of course, for your excellent ongoing commentary and analysis in Haaretz.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for having me again, Allison.
And that wraps things up for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Chuck Freilich, and to producer and editor Nara Malkin. If you'd like to continue to listen to our podcast and make sure you don't miss an episode, please subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, do not forget to subscribe and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.